Born to a wealthy family in 1860, Jane Addams was an American political activist, social worker, philosopher, sociologist, and educator. Adams is most known for the development and work done at the Hull House, situated in Chicago, Illinois. There, Adams provided housing, assistance, and education for immigrants coming into the United States. It is regarded as the first form of what is now known as social work. Because of the Whole House, many immigrants were given access to stability in the US. It also provided an opportunity to learn English and American values, which led to many of the immigrants at the Whole House to become a part of American society. Adams also provided an education to women, many of whom had not come from a background of similar privilege as Adams. The Whole House was viewed as a social experiment, with the house itself being treated as a laboratory. Adams and the other workers of the Whole House rejected this label and instead treated it as an experiment beyond the laboratory, merging theoretical and applicative processes in one. Through the work of Adams and the other workers at the Whole House, immigrants were able to avoid the labeling of other in American society. Adams' political activism took form in many famous ways. She was one of the leaders of the suffragettes. As such, she is one of the founders of American feminism. Adams referred to her feminist epistemology as sympathetic knowledge, which later became part of the groundwork of what is today referred to as ethics of care and standpoint theory. Adams was the founder of the Women's Peace Party. Adams was also an advocate for international peace. She received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931, becoming the second woman to ever be rewarded with the Nobel Prize for her efforts in advocating for peace. Adams helped found the ACLU. Adams also assisted in the formation of the NAACP, together with people such as W.E.B. Du Bois, who, like Adams, is one of the founders of American sociology. Adams' unique form of pragmatist philosophy is grounded in her own moral views. Her work at the Hull House also emphasizes her experimentalist and melioristic approach to philosophy. The Hull House was not applied separately from its place of origins. It was developed alongside it, adapting itself to the needs of the community it sought to aid. Ineffective processes were discarded, and successes weren't generalized to areas where they had yet to be tested. The Whole House was a communal process, and as such offered communal progress. The other social institutions Adams aided in creating were based on this experimentalist and melioristic philosophy. The NAACP could bring forth and offer aid to African American community. The ACLU helped enforce civil liberties. Adams' pragmatist view and philosophy differed from other well-known pragmatists as it incorporated ethics, gender, and social class, similar to how standpoint theory incorporates gender and social class into history, sociology, and other disciplined studies. Chapter 5 of Adams' 1902 book, Democracy and Social Justice, offers a philosophical evaluation of why the Pullman strikes happened. Rooted in Adams' typical melioristic approach to philosophy, she offers critique of the work of industry, not because it's ineffective, but because it's mired in individual actions in a society that is becoming more cooperative. Pullman Car Works was a business as well as a settlement built by its owner, George Pullman, to offer its employees residence. Pullman, as a man driven by individualist ethics, didn't take the time to develop his business with his employees, who became increasingly dependent. He saw his work as offering a moral good. His growing business led to an expectation of growth in his community. As an economic depression hit at the time, Pullman lowered the wages of his workers, who went on a strike as a result. The strikes attained sympathetic support from the railroad union at the time, which ultimately led to large and violent strikes between union workers and federal troops.
This is a sample reading of Jane Addams' lecture on democracy and social ethics. Reading materials were sourced from the Project Gutenberg ebook of Democracy and Social Ethics by Jane Addams. This ebook is for the use of anyone anywhere at no cost and with almost no restrictions whatsoever. Chapter 5: Industrial Amelioration. There is no doubt that the great difficulty we experience in reducing to action our imperfect code of social ethics arises from the fact that we have not yet learned to act together, and find it far from easy even to fuse our principles and aims into a satisfactory statement. We have been at times entertained by the futile efforts of half a dozen highly individualized people gathered together as a committee. Their aimless attempts to find a common method of action have recalled the wavering motion of a baby's arm before he has learned to coordinate his muscles. If, as is many times stated, we are passing from an age of individualism to one of association, there is no doubt that for decisive and effective action, the individual still has the best of it. He will secure efficient results while committees are still deliberating upon the best method of making a beginning. And yet, if need of times demand associated effort, it may easily be true that the action which appears ineffective and yet is carried out upon the more highly developed line of associated effort may represent a finer social quality and have a greater social value than the more effective individual action. It is possible that an individual may be successful largely because he conserves all his powers for individual achievement and does not put any of his energy into the training which will give him the ability to act with others. The individual acts promptly, and we are dazzled by his success while only dimly conscious of the inadequacy of his code. Nowhere is this illustrated more clearly than in industrial relations as existing between the owner of a large factory and his employees. A growing conflict may be detected between the democratic ideal, which urges the workmen to demand representation in the administration of industry, and the accepted position that the man who owns the capital and takes the risk has the exclusive right of management. It is in reality a clash between individual or aristocratic management and corporate or democratic management. A large and highly developed factory presents a sharp contrast between its socialized form and individualistic ends. It is possible to illustrate this difference by a series of events which occurred in Chicago during the summer of 1984. These events epitomized and exaggerated, but at the same time challenged the code of ethics which regulates much of our daily conduct, and clearly showed that the so-called social relations are often resting upon the will of an individual and are in reality regulated by a code of individual ethics. As this situation illustrates a point of great difficulty to which we have arrived in our development of social ethics, it may be justifiable to discuss it at some length. Let us recall the facts, not as they have been investigated and printed, but as they remain in our memories. A large manufacturing company had provided commodious workshops, and at the instigation of its president, had built a model town for the use of its employees. After a series of years, it was deemed necessary during a financial depression to reduce the wages of these employees by giving each workman less than full-time work in order to keep the shops open. This reduction was not accepted by the men, who had to become discontented with the factory management and the town regulations, and a strike ensued, followed by a complete shutdown of the works. Although these shops were non-union shops, the strikers were hastily organized and appealed for the help to the American Railway Union, which at that moment was holding its biennial meeting in Chicago. After some days' discussion and some futile attempts at arbitration, a sympathetic strike was declared, which gradually involved railway men in all parts of the country, and orderly transportation was brought to a complete standstill. In the excitement which followed, cars were burned and tracks were torn up, and the men resented the extension of industrial control to domestic and social arrangements. They felt that the lack of democracy in the assumption that they should be taken care of in these matters, in which even the humblest workman has won his independence. The basic difficulty lay in the fact that an individual was directing the social affairs of many men without any consistent effort to find out their desires, and without any organization through which to give them social expression. The president of the company was, moreover, so confident of the righteousness of his aim that he had come to test the righteousness of the process by his own feelings and not by those of the men. He doubtless built the town from a sincere desire to give his employees the best surroundings. As it developed, he gradually took toward the artist's attitude towards his own creation, which has no thought for the creation itself, but is absorbed in the idea it stands for, and he ceased to measure the usefulness of the town by the standard of the man's needs. This process slowly darkened his glimpse of money, which might have connected his experience with that of his men. It is possible to cultivate the impulses of the benefactor until the power of attaining a simple human relationship with them, the beneficiaries, that of the frank equality with them, is gone, and there is left no mutual interest in a common cause. To perform too many good deeds may be to lose power of recognizing good in others. To be too absorbed in carrying out a personal plan of improvement may be to fail to catch the great moral lesson which our times offer. The president of this company fostered his employees for many years. He gave them sanitary houses and beautiful parks, but in their extreme need, when they were struggling with the most difficult situation which the times could present to them, he lost his touch and had nothing wherewith to help them. The employer's conception of goodness for his men had been cleanliness, decency of living, and above all, thrift and temperance. Means had been provided for all this, and opportunities had also been given for recreation and improvement. But this employer suddenly found his town in the sweep of a worldwide moral impulse. A movement had been going on about him and among his working men, of which he had been unconscious, or concerning which he had heard only by rumor. Outside the ken of philanthropists, the proletariat had learned to say in many languages that the injury of one is the concern of all. Their watchwords were brotherhood, sacrifice, the subordination of individual and trade interests to the good of the working classes, and they were moved by a determination to free that class from the untoward conditions under which they were laboring. Compared to these watchwords, the old ones which this philanthropic employer had given his town were negative and inadequate. He had believed strongly in temperance and steadiness of individual effort, but had failed to apprehend the greater movement of combined abstinence and concerted action. With all his fostering, the president had not attained to a conception of social morality for his men, and had imagined that the virtue for them largely meant absence of vice. When the labor movement finally stirred his town, or, to speak more fairly, when in their distress and perplexity, his own employees appealed to an organized manifestation of this movement, they were quite sure that simply because they were workmen in distress, they would not be deserted by it. This loyalty, on the part of a widely ramified and well-organized union toward the workmen in a non-union shop, who had contributed nothing to its cause, was certainly a manifestation of moral power. In none of his utterances or correspondence did the president for an instant recognize this touch of nobility, although one would imagine that he would gladly point out this bit of virtue, and what he must have considered the moral ruin about him. He stood throughout for the individual virtues, those which had distinguished the model workmen of his youth, those which had enabled him and so many of his contemporaries to rise in life, when rising in life was urged upon every promising boy as the goal of his efforts. Of the code of social ethics he had caught absolutely nothing. The morals he had advocated in selecting and training his men did not fail them in the hour of confusion. They were self-controlled, and they themselves destroyed no property. They were sober and exhibited no drunkenness, even although obliged to hold their meetings in the saloon hall of a neighboring town. They repaid their employer in kind, but he had given them no rule for the life of association into which they were plunged. The president of the company desired that his employees should possess the individual and family virtues, but did nothing to cherish them in the social virtues which express themselves in associated effort. Day after day, during that horrible time of suspense, when the wires constantly reported the same message, the president of the company holds that there is nothing to arbitrate. One was forced to feel that the ideal of one-man rule was being sustained in its baldest form. A demand from many parts of the country and from many people was being made for social adjustment, against which the commercial training and the individualistic point of view held its own successfully. The majority of the stockholders, not only of this company, but of similar companies and many other citizens who had the same commercial experience shared and sustained this position, it was quite impossible for them to catch the other point of view. They not only felt themselves right from the commercial standpoint, but had gradually accustomed themselves also to the philanthropic standpoint until they had come to consider their motives beyond reproach. Habit helped them persistent in this view of the case through all changing conditions. A wise man had said that the consent of men and your own conscience are two wings given you, whereby you may rise to God. It is so easy for the good and powerful to think that they can rise by following the dictates of conscience, by pursuing their own ideals, that they are prone to leave those ideals unconnected with the consent of their fellow men. The president of the company thought out within his own mind a beautiful town. He had the power with which to build this town, but he did not appeal to nor obtain the consent of the men who were living in it. The most unambitious reform, recognizing the necessity for this consent, makes for slow but sane and strenuous progress, while the most ambitious of social plans and experiments, ignoring this, is prone to failure. The man who insists upon consent, who moves with the people, is bound to consult the feasible right as well as the absolute right. He is often obliged to attain only Mr. Lincoln's best possible, and then has the sickening sense of compromise with his best convictions. He has to move along with those whom he leads toward a goal that neither he nor they see very clearly till they come to it. He has to discover what people really want, and then provide the channels in which the growing moral force of their lives shall flow. What does he attain, however, is not the result of his individual striving, as a solitary mountain climber, beyond that of the valley multitude, but it is sustained and upheld by the sentiments and aspirations of many others. Progress has been slower perpendicularly, but incomparably greater because lateral. He has not taught his contemporaries to climb mountains, but he has persuaded villagers to move up a few higher feet. Added to this, he has made secure his progress. A few months after the death of the promoter of this model town, a court decision made it obligatory upon the company to divest itself of the management of the town as involving a function beyond its corporate powers. The parks, flowers, and fountains of this far-famed industrial center were dismantled, with scarcely a protest from the inhabitants themselves. The man who disassociates his ambition, however disinterested, from the cooperation of his fellows, always takes the risk of ultimate failure. He does not take advantage of the great conserver and guarantee of his own permanent success which associated efforts afford. Genuine experiments toward higher social conditions must have a more democratic faith and practice than those which underlie private venture. Public parks and improvements intended for the common use are after all only safe in the hands of the public itself, and associated effort toward social progress, although much more awakened and stumbling than that the same effort managed by a capable individual, does yet enlist deeper forces and evoke higher social capacities. The successful businessman, who is also the philanthropist, is in more than usual danger of getting widely separated from his employees. The men already have the American veneration for wealth and successful business capacity, and, added to this, they are dazzled by his good works. The workmen have the same kindly impulses as he, but while they organize their charity into mutual benefit associations and distribute their money in small amounts in relief for the widows and insurance for the injured, the employer may build model towns, erect college buildings, which are tangible and enduring, and thereby display his goodness in concentrated form. By the very exigencies of business demands, the employer is too often cut off from the social ethics developing in regard to our larger social relationships, and from the great moral life springing from our common experiences. This is sure to happen when he is good to people rather than with them. when he allows himself to decide what is best for them instead of consulting them. He thus misses the rectifying influence of that fellowship, which is so big that it leaves no room for sensitiveness or gratitude. Without this fellowship, we may never know how great the divergence between ourselves and others may become, or how cruel the misunderstandings. During a recent strike of the employees of a large factory in Ohio, the president of the company expressed himself as bitterly disappointed by the results of his many kindnesses, and evidently considered the employees utterly unappreciative. His state of mind was the result of the fallacy of ministering to social needs from an individual impulse and expecting a socialized return of gratitude and loyalty. If the lunchroom was necessary, it was a necessity in order that employees might have better food. And when they had received the better food, the legitimate aim of the lunchroom was met. If baths were desirable, and the 15 minutes of calisthenic exercise given the women in the middle of each half day brought a needed rest and change to their muscles, then the increased cleanliness and increased bodily comfort of so many people should of themselves have justified the experiment. To demand, as a further result, that there should be no strikes in the factory, no revolts against the will of the employer, because the employees were filled with loyalty as a result of the kindness, was of course to take the experiment from an individual basis to a social one. Large mining companies and manufacturing concerns are constantly appealing to their stockholders for funds, or for permission to take a percentage of the profits, in order that the money may be used for educational and social schemes designed for the benefit of the employees. The promoters of these schemes use as an argument and as an appeal that better relations will thus be established, that strikes will be prevented, and that in the end, the money returned to the stockholders will be increased. However praiseworthy this appeal may be in motive, it involves a distinct confusion of issues, and in theory deserves the failure it so often meets with in the practice. In the clash which follows a strike, the employees are accused of an ingratitude, when there was no legitimate reason to expect gratitude, and useless bitterness, which has a really fictitious basis, may be developed on both sides. Indeed, unless the relation becomes a democratic one, the chances of misunderstanding are increased. When to the relation of employer and employee is added the relation of benefactor to beneficiaries, insofar as there is still another opportunity for acting upon the individual code of ethics, there is no doubt that these efforts are to be commended, not only from the standpoint of their social value, but because they have a marked industrial significance. Failing, as they do, however, to touch the question of wages and hours, which are almost invariably the points of trades union effort. The employers confuse the mind of the public when they urge the amelioration of conditions and the kindly relation existing between them and their men as a reason for the discontinuance of strikes and other trades union tactics. The men have individually accepted the kindness of the employers as it was individually offered, but quite as the latter urges his inability to increase wages unless he has the cooperation of his competitors, so the men state that they are bound to the trades union struggle for an increase in wages because it can only be undertaken by combinations of labor. Even the much more democratic effort to divide a proportion of the profits at the end of the year among the employees upon the basis of their wages and efficiency is also exposed to a weakness, from the fact that the employing side has the power of determining to whom the benefit shall accrue. Both individual acts of self-defense on the part of the wage earner and individual acts of benevolence on the part of the employer are most useful as they establish standards to which the average worker and employer may in time be legally compelled to form. Progress must always come through the individual who varies from the type and has sufficient energy to express this variation. He first holds a higher conception than that held by the mass of his fellows of what is righteous under given conditions, and expresses this conviction in conduct, in many instances formulating a certain scruple which others share, but have not yet defined even to themselves. Progress, however, is not secured until the mass has conformed to this new righteousness. This is equally true in regard to any advance made in the standard of living on the part of trades unionists or in the improved conditions of industry on the part of reforming employers. The mistakes lie not in overpraising the advance thus inaugurated by individual initiative, but in regarding the achievement as complete in a social sense when it is still in the realm of individual action. No sane manufacturer regards his factory as the center of the industrial system. He knows very well that the cost of material, wages, and selling prices are determined by industrial conditions completely beyond his control. Yet the same man may calmly regard himself and his own private principles as merely self-regarding, and expect results from casual philanthropy which can only be accomplished through those common rules of life and labor established by the community for the common good. Outside of and surrounding these smaller and most significant efforts are the larger and irresistible movements operating toward combination. This movement must tend to decide upon social matters from the social standpoint. Until then, it is difficult to keep our minds free from a confusion of issues. Such a confusion occurs when the gift of a large sum to the community for a public and philanthropic purpose throws a certain glamour over all the earlier acts of man and makes it difficult for the community to see possible wrongs committed against it. In the accumulation of wealth, so beneficently used, it is possible also that the resolve to be thus generous unconsciously influences the man himself in his methods of accumulation. He keeps to a certain individual rectitude, meaning to make an individual restitution by the old paths of generosity and kindness, whereas if he had in view social restitution on the newer lines of justice and opportunity, he would throughout his course doubtless be watchful of his industrial relationships and his social virtues. The danger of professionally attaining to the power of the righteous man, of yielding to ambition for doing good on a large scale, compared to which ambition for politics, learning, or wealth are vulgar and commonplace, ramifies through our modern life, and those easily beset by this temptation are precisely the men best situated to experiment on the larger social lines, because they so easily dramatize their acts and lead public opinion. Very often, too, they have in their hands the preservation and advancement of large vested interest, and often see clearly and truly that they are better able to administer the affairs of the community than the community itself. Sometimes they concede that if they do not administer them sharply and quickly, as only an individual can, certain interests of theirs dependent upon the community will go to ruin. The model employer first considered provided a large sum in his will with which to build and equip a polytechnic school, which will doubtless be of great public value. This again shows the advantage of individual management, in the spending as well as in the accumulation of wealth. But this school will attain its highest good insofar as it incites the ambition to provide other schools from public funds. The town of Zurich possesses a magnificent polytechnic institute, secured by the vote of the entire people and supported from public taxes. Every man who voted for it is interested that his child should enjoy its benefits, and of course, the voluntary attendance must be larger than in a school accepted as a gift to the community. In the educational efforts of employers, as in other attempts towards social amelioration, one man with the best of intentions is trying to do what the entire body of employees should have undertaken to do for themselves. The result of his efforts will only attain its highest value as it serves as an incentive to procure other results by the community as well as for the community. There are doubtless many things which the public would never demand unless they were first supplied by individual initiative, both because the public lacks imagination and also the power of formulating their wants. Thus, philanthropic effort supplies kindergartens until they become so established in the popular affections that they are incorporated into the public school system. Churches and missions establish reading rooms until at last the public library system dots the city with branch reading rooms and libraries. For this willingness to take risk for the sake of an ideal, for those experiments which must be undertaken with vigor and boldness in order to secure didactic value in failure as well as in success. Society must depend upon the individual possessed with money and also distinguished by earnest and unselfish purpose. Such experiments enable the nation to use the referendum method in its public affairs. Each social experiment is thus tested by a few people, given wide publicity, that it may be observed and discussed by the bulk of the citizens before the public prudently makes up its mind whether or not it is wise to incorporate it into the functions of government. If the decision is in its favor, and it is so incorporated, it can be carried on with confidence and enthusiasm. But experience has shown that we can only depend upon successful men for a certain type of experiment in the line of industrial amelioration and social advancement. The list of those who found churches, educational institutions, libraries, and art galleries is very long, as is again the list of those contributing to model dwellings, recreation halls, and athletic fields. At the present moment, factory employers are doing much to promote industrial betterment in a way of sanitary surroundings, opportunities in bathing, lunchrooms provided with cheap and wholesome food, club rooms, and guide halls. But there is a line of social experiment involving social righteousness in its most advanced form, in which the number of employers in the favored class are so few that it is plain society cannot count upon them for continuous and valuable help. This lack is in the line of factory legislation and that sort of social advance implied in shorter hours and the regulation of wages, in short, all that organization and activity that is involved in such maintenance and increase of wages as would prevent the lowering of the standard of life. A large body of people feel keenly that the present industrial system is in a state of profound disorder, and that there is no guarantee that the pursuit of individual ethics will ever be right. They claim that relief can only come through deliberate corporate effort inspired by social ideals and guided by the study of economic laws, and that the present industrial system thwarts our ethical demands, not only for social righteousness, but for social order. Because they believe that each advance in ethics must be made fast by a corresponding advance in politics and legal enactment, they insist upon the right of state regulation and control. While many people representing all classes in a community would assent to this as a general proposition, and would even admit it as a certain moral obligation, legislative enactments designed to control industrial conditions have largely been secured through the effort of a few citizens, mostly those who constantly see the harsh conditions of labor and who are incited to activity by their sympathies as well as their convictions. This may be illustrated by the series of legal enactments regulating the occupations in which children may be allowed to work. Also the laws in regard to the hours of labor permitted in those occupations and the minimum age below which children may not be employed. The first child labor laws were enacted in England through the efforts of those members of Parliament whose hearts were wrung by the condition of the little parish apprentices bound out to the early textile manufacturers of the North, and through the long years required to build up the code of child labor legislation which England now possesses. Knowledge of those conditions has always preceded effective legislation. The efforts of that small number in every community who believe in legislative control have always been reinforced by the efforts of trades unionists rather than by the efforts of employers, partly because the employment of working men in the factories brings them in contact with the children who tend to lower wages and demoralize their trades, and partly because working men have no money nor time to spend in alleviating philanthropy, and must perforce seize upon agitation and legal enactment as the only channel of redress which is open to them. We may illustrate by imagining a row of people seated in a moving streetcar, into which starts a boy of 8, calling out the details of the last murder, in the hope of selling in an evening newspaper. A comfortable-looking man buys a paper from him with no sense of moral shock. He may even be a trifle complacent that he has helped along the little fellow who is making his way in the world. The philanthropic lady sitting next to him may perhaps reflect that it is a pity that such a bright boy is not in school. She may make up her mind in a moment of compunction to redouble her efforts for various newsboys, schools, and homes, that this poor child may have better teaching and perhaps a chance at manual training. She probably is convinced that he alone, by his unaided efforts, is supporting a widowed mother, and her heart is moved to do all she can for him. Next to her sits a working man, trained in trades union methods. He knows that the boy's natural development is arrested, and that the abnormal activity of his body and mind uses up the force which should go into growth. Moreover, that this premature use of his powers has but a momentary and specious value. He is forced to these conclusions because he has seen many a man, entering the factory at 18 and 20, so worn out by premature work that he was laid on the shelf within 10 or 15 years. He knows very well that he can do nothing in the way of ameliorating the lot of this particular boy, that his only possible chance is to agitate for proper child labor laws, to regulate, and if possible, prohibit street vending by children, in order that the children of the poorest may have his school time secured to him, and may have at least his short chance for growth. These 3 people sitting in the streetcar are all honest and upright, and recognize a certain duty toward the forlorn children of the community. The self-made man is encouraging one boy's own efforts. The philanthropic lady is helping on a few boys. The working man alone is obliged to include all the boys in his class. Working men, because of their feebleness in all but numbers, have been forced to appeal to the state in order to secure protection for themselves and for their children. They cannot all rise out of their class, as the occasionally successful man has done. Some of them must be left to do the work in the factories and mines, and they have no money to spend in philanthropy. Both public agitation and social appeal to the conscience of the community is necessary in order to secure help from the state, and, curiously enough, child labor laws once enacted and enforced are a matter of great pride, and even come to be regarded as a register of the community's humanity and enlightenment. If the method of public agitation could find quiet and orderly expression in legislative enactment, and if labor measures could be submitted to the examination and judgment of the whole without a sense of division or of warfare, we should have the ideal development of the democratic state. But we judge labor organizations as we do other living institutions, not by their declaration of principles, which we seldom read, but by their blundering efforts to apply their principles to actual conditions, and by the oft-time failure of their representatives, when the individual finds himself too weak to become the organ of corporate action. The very blunders and lack of organization too often characterizing a union, in marked contrast to the orderly management of a factory, often confuse us as to the real issues involved, and we find it hard to trust uncouth and ruly manifestations of social effort. The situation is made even more complicated by the fact that those who are formulating a code of associated action so often break through the established code of law and order. As society has a right to demand of the reforming individual that he be sternly held to his personal and domestic claims, so it has a right to insist that labor organizations shall keep to the hardly won standards of public law and order. And the community performs but it is plain duty when it registers its protest every time law and order are subverted, even in the interest of the so-called social effort. Yet in moments of industrial stress and strain, the community is confronted by a moral perplexity which may arise from the mere act that the good of yesterday is opposed to the good of today, and that which may appear as a choice between virtue and vice is really but a choice between virtue and virtue. In the disorder and confusion sometimes incident to growth and progress, the community may be unable to see anything but the unlovely struggle itself. The writer calls a conversation between two working men who were leaving a lecture on organic evolution. The first was much puzzled and anxiously inquired of the second if evolution can mean that one animal turned into another. The challenged workman stopped in the rear of the hall, put his foot upon a chair, and expounded what he thought evolution did mean. And this, so nearly as the conversation can be recalled, is what he said. You see, a lot of fishes are living in the stream, which overflows in the spring, and strands some of them upon the bank. The weak ones die up there, but others make a big effort to get back into the water. They dig their fins into the sand, breathe as much air as they can with their gills, and have a terrible time. But after a while, their fins turn into legs, and their gills into lungs, and they have become frogs. Of course, they are further along than the sleek, comfortable fishes who sail up and down the stream, waving their tails, despising the poor damaged things thrashing around on the bank. He, the lecturer, did not say anything about men, but it is easy enough to think of us poor devils on the dry bank, struggling without enough to live on, while the comfortable fellows sail along in the water with all they want and despise us because we thrash about. His listener did not reply, and was evidently dissatisfied with both the explanation and the application. Doubtless the illustration was bungling in more than it is setting forth, but the story is suggestive. At times of social disturbance, the law-abiding citizen is naturally so anxious for peace and order. His sympathies are so justly and inevitably on the side making for the restoration of law, that it is difficult for him to see the situation fairly. He becomes insensible to the unselfish impulse which may prompt a sympathetic strike in behalf of the workers in a non-union shop. Because he follows his mind to dwell exclusively on the disorder which has become associated with the strike, he is completely sidetracked by the ugly phases of a great moral movement. Always a temptation to assume that the side which has respectability, authority, and superior intelligence, righteousness as well, especially when the same side presents concrete results of individual effort as over against the less tangible results of associated effort. It is as yet most difficult for us to free ourselves from the individualistic point of view sufficiently to the group events in their social relations, and to judge fairly those who are endeavoring to produce a social result through all the difficulties of associated action. The philanthropist still finds his path much easier than do those who are attempting social morality. In the first place, the public, anxious to praise what it recognizes as an undoubted moral effort, often attended with real personal sacrifice, joyfully seizes upon this manifestation and overpraises it, recognizing the philanthropist as an old friend in the paths of righteousness, whereas the others are strangers and possibly to be distrusted as aliens. It is easy to confuse the response to an abnormal number of individual claims with the response to the social claim. An exaggerated personal morality is often mistaken for a social morality, and until it attempts to minister to a social situation, its total inadequacy is not discovered. To attempt to attain a social morality without a basis of democratic experience results in the loss of the only possible corrective and guide, and ends in an exaggerated individual morality, but not in social morality at all. We see this from time to time in the careworn and overworked philanthropist who has taxed his individual well beyond the normal limits and has lost his clue to the situation among a bewildering number of cases. A man who takes the betterment of humanity for his aim and end must also take the daily experiences of humanity for the constant correction of his process. He must not only test and guide his achievement by human experience, but he must succeed or fail in proportion as he has incorporated that experience with his own. Otherwise, his own achievements become his stumbling block, and He comes to believe in his own goodness as something outside of himself. He makes an exception of himself, and thinks that he is different from the rank and file of his fellows. He forgets that it is necessary to know the lives of our contemporaries, not only in order to believe in their integrity, which is, after all, but the first beginnings of social morality, but in order to attain to any mental or moral integrity for ourselves, or any such hope for society.